Andrew, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. Very happy to have you.
Johnny, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Great. I'm glad to hear that. I've been looking forward to speaking to you for a while, just because I think that not only do we look alike a little bit, but we're putting out pretty similar content. We're both focused on consciousness and kind of helping people navigate their anxiety and some sense of existentialism. But maybe a good place to start for this conversation would be just the question of who is Andrew?
That question's getting harder and harder to answer, honestly. Because it's funny because that question of who is Andrew is it's like Andrew is a definable sort of character, but it's not necessarily like as much as I recognize that it is what I am to a degree, it makes it way easier for me to identify when someone is trying to get my attention. And everyone sort of gets caught up in that idea of identity. And we can get deeper into that. I don't want to go on this like 10-minute tangent before I actually answer your question and just like be an ass for saying like, oh, I'm not actually Andrew. It's like I'll give you a rundown for sure. And yeah, so I grew up in Minnesota, played a bunch of sports growing up, ended up playing baseball in college. And then from there, I played baseball at Penn and Philly, and then moved to New York, got a job there, have had the same job for the last coming up on 4 years now. So that's like super quick rundown of my life. Going back to like on the mental health side of things, what sort of got me into all the stuff I talk about was back in high school when I was like 15, 16 years old. Kind of a common age for people to deal with, social anxiety, things like that.
Sure.
I dealt with quite a bit. I cared a lot about what people thought of me. I was always afraid of how people were perceiving me. I was worried about the future constantly. And it lasted for a few years, and it kind of sucked in the moment. It was not a whole lot of fun. It wasn't that it was, necessarily a constant thing, but the way it manifested for me was, especially while I was at school, I was very quiet because I figured it wasn't that I wanted everyone to like me. It was that I didn't want anyone to dislike me. So the way that manifested for me was I was just like, okay, well, if I just don't say anything, then no one can really have much of a strong opinion of me at all. And as much as that sort of makes sense to your mind to like keep you safe, it creates a ton of suffering because there were times I wanted to speak out, but it was like, oh, well, what's this person going to think? Or what's that person going to think? Or is this person going to not like what I say? Or is this person going to judge me for saying this? And all of these different things. And it's like, now, obviously, I'm in a much different place in my life, but I still remember how it felt to be like that. And so throughout college, it got a little bit less severe just naturally, I think. And then I started to get into meditation, sort of spirituality, recognition of, right now is the only thing there ever is. And I sort of understood that conceptually at first. And now I think I understand it as like the recognition that it's the reality of what I am. Then from there, towards the end of college, got into that stuff, and it helped me a ton. And I improved in a lot of ways, or like overcame a lot of those feelings. And then sort of the last hurdle was creating content. And that's just like a whole nother story, getting into that and the journey since then. But started creating content about 2 years ago. It's just, a deep feeling inside of me that something I knew I'd regret if I didn't do it. And so it was not easy to start. Like I was super afraid. Still, after going through all of that, it's like creating content's like another level of that. And so finally I just started about 2 years ago, and yeah, been a journey ever since. But that's some semblance of a synopsis of the character of Andrew thus far.
Now, I appreciate you running us through that. And for listeners, that was definitely a loaded question. Just having consumed quite a bit of your content, I knew that asking who is Andrew like that would provoke a more thought-provoking answer than I think many other guests might have given me. But I appreciate you giving me the rundown. I wanted to ask you about maybe the inciting incident that kind of took you on this path, not to creating content, but maybe that changed the shift in your mentality. So like for me, like I can relate to your story a lot. I think that maybe our defense mechanisms were different, in that I didn't speak because I didn't think people would like me, but I think I behaved in ways that I thought would get people to like me more. I'm more of an introvert, and I think I would like force myself to be extroverted a lot just because I just saw extroverts were liked. So I was like, I'll just be an extrovert too. And that's not a great setting if you're an introvert, you know what I mean? But for me, I think the change was I read a book called Meditations that talk about that quite a lot here. And it kind of got me into stoicism. And then from there, just branched out into a ton of different areas. But I'm curious, did you have anything like that where it was maybe a specific book or a specific movie or something that you read that triggered something in you that kind of got you on a more spiritual philosophical path?
Yeah. So towards the end of college, I mentioned that's when I first started getting into some of these recognitions. And I read The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle and The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck by Mark Manson. And those two combined kind of helped me with a lot of things. I will say with The Power of Now, I think people can get caught up in thinking of the present moment as like a concept when they get through that book. And there are parts of it, like I love Eckhart, but I think there's aspects where, he may not live the same type of life as like the average American who has a bunch of different random shit going on all the time. And I still remember when I started work, I would turn like my do not disturb on because I had just spent the summer. I kind of had the summer off in between graduation and I started work in September. And I was just like, that summer was very life changing in a lot of ways because I was just very structured in like having a set morning routine, which helped me at that point. I've kind of gotten away from that purposefully now, but I was meditating a lot and just like my individual like opinions and preferences for what I wanted to do because I was so at peace with just like being and just like being alive that I didn't really care what I did, like my sister wanted to go to the mall and like look at clothes. Like I always hated the mall and I would just be like, yeah, sure, let's do that. That seems like a cool thing to do. But yeah, getting into those two books helped a lot. So yeah, I would say those two. And then the really impactful moment in my life was about a year ago where I was going through and for a while I sort of had a morning routine and a very set and structured morning routine that for like 3 years. It was like meditation, gratitude, positivity, affirmations, all that stuff. And last summer I was going through a week where just having a tougher week, one of those low weeks in life that we all go through, but it lasted. Usually those only last at that point. It was like a day or two for me. And this one was lasting like a week. And I was trying all these things that I had always relied on. I call them now like sort of identity based practices, things like gratitude and positivity affirmations and even meditation to a degree. And like nothing was working. Nothing was helping me feel any better because to a degree, like they all sort of reinforce the idea of yourself and they reinforce this idea that you are what you think you are and you are this character that is separate from everything. And I think you can get deeper into things where you're able to sort of like transmute that identity. And so that week, it was just like nothing was working and I was suffering and it just kind of sucked. It was a shitty week. And finally I was actually listening to one of Eckhart Tolle's audiobooks called Stillness Speaks. And there's just a part where it mentioned that, the past doesn't exist and you don't actually have a past and stuff like that or something along those lines. And I had made videos about that at that point. I had understood it conceptually, but I was able in that moment to recognize or imagine for a second that like I literally didn't have a past. Like I was just aware of my surroundings. I was walking around New York. I was just aware of the street I was on, aware of the things I could hear, the things I could see. And like I imagined like I literally had no past. Like I was just born in that moment. And it was like all of that weight that I was carrying of worry about the future based on things that happened in the past was just like shed immediately. And it was like one of the most freeing things I ever experienced. And then I was able to go a little bit deeper as I continued walking and recognize that, if I don't actually have a past and my past has nothing to do with the reality of what I am as the present moment, then, and this idea of Andrew is just the past. And I was able to kind of create some space in between that idea of Andrew and the recognition of what I am as, the present moment. And that's sort of it, like literally that being the crux of my being. And so ever since then, I have not seen things in the same way whatsoever. So that was probably the most, jarring, freeing experience of my life was just that day where I recognized that. And so that was probably the most impactful, although there was a lot sort of leading up to that, even though that was as extreme as it was, there was, a lot of steps that kind of came with it. But again, it's like sort of a journey nowhere at the end of the day, or now here, as I like to say.
Yeah, I like that, the idea of not having a past, just because like I think I might see things a little bit differently, just in terms of like we are a collection of our own experiences, right? It's hard to disregard the entirety of your past, right? Because you have relationships that are born in the past. But I do like the idea of, just because you were selfish in the past, or you were impatient in the past, or you were all these ways in the past, that doesn't really have any bearings of who you are now. That's really up to you in whatever moment that you're in. And so at least that's how I've come to understand it. But it's really interesting to hear your perspective on it. So you have the podcast Dualistic Unity. If you were to summarize it in just like one sentence, what would you say? To me, it seems like it's really just exploring consciousness and the ideas and maybe the inner workings of the mind. But how would you describe it?
Ooh, in a sentence might be tough. It's it's basically rooted in the recognition that I am everything, and what I identify with, all of those things in the past that I identify with as, X type of person or Y type of person, or having this strength or this weakness, is an illusion of identity. And basically, not to get too deep into things, but our society, in my opinion, is basically experiencing mass psychosis. Like, I literally think our entire society is experiencing a psychosis of identity and thinking that we are primarily something separate from anything. And we think it's based on our past. It's based on, the name that we're given, based on how we look, all of those things. But those are all more or less figments of our imagination, and really only exist inside of our mind. And you can kind of pick it apart one by one. Like name, for example, that's a super common one that everyone identifies as their name, and it's absolutely helpful for convenience sake, but it isn't the truth of what you are. Your name is just something you're given by your parents. It's just a noise that's been attached to you that you can use for convenience sake in order to communicate with people. It's like, a tree isn't the word tree. It's just what it is. And so as you're able to pick apart all of those labels, whether it's in nature, or, name of a building, or the name of a person, and just see that everything just is, like, we're just beings that have evolved essentially from the earth, which came from all different other sorts of things. So at the end of the day, like, we're all just the earth, like, walking around, and we just identify as separate things. And those identities that we cling to, that, yes, they're more convenient than anyone not having an identity. Like, if we didn't have names and I wanted to get someone's attention and I said, "Hey, you," and it was a big group of people, everyone turns around. It's like, well, shit, that's not super helpful. But, we build up this entire story about what we're good at, what we're bad at, and all of these limitations to the reality of what we are as limitless potential here and now. And any idea that we cling to is inherently limiting relative to infinity, relative to infinite potential. Even positive ideas of ourselves are still limiting, because as we cling to those, if someone questions it, all of a sudden we have something to defend. And you see it a lot with, celebrities. We use the term like they have a big ego or something, because when someone questions them, it's like they cling to that identity. They identify with it for a sense of, security and importance. And there's tons of different reasons why people cling to identity, but people do it on the negative side too. And, we have things like victim identity, and people who cling to it in that, they can tell other people they would never understand them because they haven't been through the thing that they've been through. And it's all rooted in that mass psychosis, is like how I think of it. I know that seems kind of extreme, but when you start to see things in a different light and see and begin to question that idea of yourself, you start to see it in everyone else and see that like that's the root of everyone's psychological suffering is what they think they are, essentially.
Very, very interesting perspective on all this. I like what you said about us being all separate and the idea that we are basically our own enemy when it comes to limiting our potential. Because you make a great point too when you're talking about like, even when it's a good thing, you're still limiting your potential because not only are you saying, well, I'm only this good at this thing, but it kind of almost like boxes out everything else that you could also be at the same time. But it's funny because you know the guy I mentioned earlier that I sat down and had a conversation with, he was telling me that like his main thing was that language is the enemy because it's what causes us to see ourselves as separate from everything else. Like all language really is a way of siloing all these aspects of existence in the earth into these things that we can understand, when really, to your point about potential, it limits our ability to understand them because now a tree is just a tree and that's all it is. It's a tree. But you know, you talk about like being able to see things without judgment, with more clarity. And it kind of reminds me of Shrek, which is probably not what you were expecting me to say. But there's a line where he's telling Donkey like ogres are like onions, like they have layers. And I feel like the ego is like that, where it's like the ego has a lot of layers to it. Like I think oftentimes like somebody will say something to me that I'll get offended by, and it's like I shouldn't actually be offended. That has nothing to do with me. It's just I'm bringing all my experience and all my judgments into this thing that this person probably isn't even registering. And I think that like we take that into, you know, our relationships with other people, but more broadly, I think we're so conditioned to seeing things through the lens of ego that we can't even recognize when it's playing into our own psyche. You know, it's like we talk about being separate from everything, and I think like one of the negative aspects of being in America is it's like hyper individualized, where individualism is the ultimate goal for everyone and expressing that in any way that you can. I think that's really cool for art, but when it's scaled back to a life, I feel like it causes us to consistently see things through like, how are people perceiving me, what judgments are being sent my way, and how can I navigate this path where everyone is seeing life through this lens.
Yeah. I've like three different thoughts on those things you just said, but starting with the onion analogy, that's actually an analogy I use for explaining mushrooms and identity. And so the way I explain it with like, you know, different dosages and different mentalities going into it is like, you know, someone who is very sure of the way things are and the way things should be, and they have very staunch like political affiliations and religious views, and they're like, this is the way it is, this is the way it should be, and no one can change my mind. It's like that person has, say, like 20 layers, and then someone who is more open to questioning things and a little bit more open-minded and sees both sides of the conversation, they might have like exist soberly with 10 layers. So person with 20 layers, like they probably feel very separate from everything, and the person with 10 layers maybe feels less separate. So, you know, just through sober experience, questioning, allowing yourself to question some of the things that you believe to be the truth can help peel back some of those layers and get someone from 20 to 10 layers. So when it comes to the individuality aspect as well that you were talking about before, I think I mentioned earlier that I have started to see myself as just like the earth walking around, as opposed to like this person separate from it. And so the more closely you are identified with an individuality, and that's it, a person with like, you know, these points of view and these opinions and these fears and worries and all of this stuff, and when you identify as an individual as opposed to, you know, something like the earth or the universe or existence experiencing itself, it's like people rarely, you know, they're not going to judge the earth. They're not going to be like, oh, the earth is pretty fugly, you know.
Yeah.
It's like it could look better. So there's not going to be, when someone comes at you as this individual, it's like you can clearly see that they're just projecting their own insecurities onto you. And so the more broadly you sort of identify with things and see existence or reality is like this massive tapestry and you are just a thread among the tapestry, then there isn't as much self-consciousness that goes along with that, because you don't see yourself anymore as this individual thing that could be judged. And that's just like, anyone has the ability to do that. I think with that, you have to let go of, the positive side of ego as well. You can't really have both. And so when people, pat you on the back and say, great job, or, oh, you're doing so well, or that was such a great, presentation or whatever, it's like, you can absolutely accept that, but you have to be able to let that go and not take that to be the truth as well. And that's, I think, a side of it that people don't express as often, because as I began to let go of that, side of identity and whatnot, there was a part of me that wanted to go back to that. But because I was able to so clearly see like the negative side of it, it made it a lot easier to not go running back and cling to the positive side of the ego, because it's very much a double-edged sword. And if you're relying on your sense of worth on that identity you've built, as people have positive judgments, you'll feel better. As people have negative judgments, you'll feel worse, and you'll constantly be going up and down, up and down, up and down. But if you're able to recognize that no matter what anyone says about you, you're as perfectly whole and complete as you could ever possibly be in every single moment that you're experiencing, and nothing you ever do can make yourself more or less complete than you are right now. It's like you're sort of existing on a different set of tracks than that up and down of the ego. And it's just like, do what you want to do with your life, see that you're everyone, see that if you traded experiences with someone else, if you traded experiences, childhood, parents, atom for atom, all of it with someone else, you would act exactly as they do. That allows you to continue experiencing empathy for everyone, because I think that's a super important aspect of letting go of more identity, is continuing to feel that empathy for everyone else, or else it can get a little bit dark, I think, in certain ways, and get to like disassociation. And I think that's the main difference between how, someone who begins to let go of their idea of themselves, how that differs from disassociation, is that empathy that you see yourself in everyone, as opposed to letting go of that idea of yourself and continuing to see division as opposed to unity.
It's interesting. I think I'm somewhere in the middle of maybe how you would, I guess, a more generalized view of existence than your view of existence, which is the fact that, we're a thread of the universe. We are existence experiencing itself. Are you familiar with philosopher George Santayana?
I'm not, no.
Okay. I think you would really dig him. He has this view of the world experiencing itself, and that his thing is like, it's very similar to yours, which is like nihilistic optimism. So I think he was born in Spain, but he's considered like an American philosopher. And his whole thing was that like he grew up in the Catholic Church, and he didn't have any bad experiences with the church. He was like, Catholicism is great. I see the function that it has for people, but I just can't get myself to subscribe to that. So rather than judging people who do, I'm going to say, hey, you know what? That works for you, but it doesn't work for me. So I need to figure out what does. And then what the conclusion he came to is like, we're just the universe experiencing itself. At some point, we're all going to die. But the beauty of existence is that, we got to do it in the first place. So I've always really admired that aspect of things when we talk about the world expressing itself. You said something about positive ego that I wanted to maybe challenge you a little bit on, which was that, when we give up this idea that we're so special and important, and we submit to the idea that we're really just this thread in the universe, I think that you do have to let go of the positive aspects of ego. And that's something that I've been wrestling with a lot, because I think that there are a ton of negative aspects of ego. What I'm trying to thread through is like, how can I use the positive aspects of ego? And like I think this podcast is an extension of that. Like your podcast is an extension of it. It's like, even though we have these things, we're all one, we have all these things in common, there are certain things that, like, maybe our names are Johnny Nava, maybe your name is Andrew Murnane, but it gets back to the idea of like the soul, right? Like this idea, the soul is just like a word that we use to describe that thing that is just purely us. So I'm just curious what you think of that, because you also have a podcast and do a lot of things that are an expression of Andrew Murnane.
Yeah, for sure. And that's a great point because I don't want to discount the reality of the experience that we have, like as much as I have recognized that, yeah, maybe it is just an illusion, this illusion of duality that we're experiencing. It still is what is. We still have the perception of division here, which allows us to have this experience. So when I think of ego, I don't think of it as a good or a bad thing. It just is, and it's actually a requirement for this experience. I think of it like our ticket to having this experience of duality. It allows us to perceive division, even if you can recognize that it's not actually the truth. It's still, our reality right now is we're having a conversation. I'm not going to discount that there aren't things happening here, and there are people who get into non-duality and they get into like the concept of it, and they almost take it too far where it's another belief and they discount the experience that they're having. But I do think when it comes to, doing things, it's like when people get into nihilism or optimistic, whether it's optimistic or pessimistic, the main difference is when people ask, well, why do anything? My response is, why not? Because you can.
Yeah.
Because you can. And that's it at the end of the day. It's not necessarily because you have to. It's not even because you should. It's just because you can, and you have the ability. And being a human is very cool, and there's a lot of capabilities that we have. But I think as you're able to let go of the positive and the negative side of ego and all of those concepts that come with being a human and becoming rich and famous or whatever, like there's pros and cons to all of those things. As you're able to let go of those, you're able to come back more closely to the recognition of your reality here and now, and see that just being able to be on this Zoom call talking to a microphone, explain this while I use my hands a lot when I talk, while using my hands and sitting here, and you being on the other side of the country, like this is a crazy experience that we're having right now. And as you're able to let go of those ideas, you're able to more clearly recognize just how cool like this moment that you're in is, just because it is, not because there's a famous person sitting next to you, not because you're at a club that's super expensive and blah blah blah, not because you just made a lot of money, just because you're here now. And being a human on earth is pretty cool.
Yeah. And like you could have been anything else, but like we get to be humans, and being it has to be the best thing to be, even for all of its drawbacks. Like we get to make art, we get to talk to one another, we explore these bigger philosophical concepts, and all that's really fucking cool. So yeah, it's a great point. I wanted to ask you about optimistic nihilism. I know we kind of just touched on it a little bit, but I wanted to maybe unpack that a little bit more, because it's something that I subscribe to as well. I wouldn't call myself the optimistic nihilist just because I'm like so obsessed with stoicism. I just kind of like embrace that a little bit more. But this, I like what you said a lot, like why should we do anything? It's like, because we can. And to me, optimistic nihilism has been rooted in the idea that you have a choice. And I think that like when people are really unhappy, a lot of the times it's because the choice was made for them to some regard, that it's not their own. You hear all the time of like, my dad really wanted me to be a doctor, so I was a doctor. My dad wanted to be a lawyer, so I became a lawyer, and I ultimately wasn't a lawyer. And that's because it's like somebody else chose your purpose for you. I think one of the beautiful things about being human is that like we get to choose who we are and what matters to us and what our purpose is. And I think that's the root of optimistic nihilism to me. I'm curious what it means to you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think optimistic nihilism or nihilism is just the recognition that there isn't anything that has to matter to you. Like when I say stuff and make videos like nothing matters, I've started caveating that afterwards with like, besides what you want to matter.
Yeah.
Like, but there isn't this objective thing, because I lived a lot of my life. I had pretty structured upbringing. Like I love my family and parents and all of that, and give them a ton of credit for everything that I've experienced, and I'm very grateful for them. But I definitely grew up in a situation where I did feel like there was sort of a blueprint for success, and there were things that objectively mattered and had to
Hmm.
matter. And I think to a degree, like it's helpful for children to have a little bit of that structure for sure, just because they, they're learning new things all the time, and they kind of need that nurturing to a degree. But once I started to see that, oh, this thing doesn't have to objectively matter. It's like if we lived in a society where there were things that objectively mattered, like that would suck. And that's a lot of times my argument for
Yeah.
people who are, anti-optimistic nihilism. It's like, okay, well, let's go through a hypothetical real quick. Let's say we did live in a society where something did objectively matter, like basketball mattered. Like we were on a planet that had to play
Space
another
Jam.
planet in basketball, and if we lost, like our planet was getting blown up. Like basketball would matter a lot to our society, and everyone would grow up playing basketball. We'd pick the best basketball players. And even if you liked baseball or you liked reading or you liked swimming, it's like, no, you're playing basketball because that objectively matters. It's beautiful. It's like one of the most beautiful things about life is that nothing does objectively matter. So we get to choose what matters to us. And the point you made about people making decisions for you, like there are absolutely situations where it's much more difficult to make your own decisions. But I think it's also important for people to see that, like, as tough as it may be, they do still have the choice. And it sucks that certain parents are so overbearing and try and like force their kids to do certain things that maybe they don't want to do. But even with that, although the consequences may be drastic, although you may be, even go as far as being ostracized from your parents and your family and all of that, if you don't do what they want to do, you do still have the choice. You do still have the choice to do something else. And we always have the choice. And at the same time, there are always consequences one way or the other to our actions. And when I say consequences, I don't just mean like negative things. I look at consequences as just, repercussions to our actions. And for every action, there is a reaction. For every action, there are repercussions, there are consequences, no matter what we do. And so a consequence to following your parents and doing exactly what they say could be a lot of suffering and depression for the rest of your life. And
Hmm.
so there's always trade-offs to everything. But at the end of the day, like you do have a choice. And people say that, for work, they like complain about work. And it's like, you have the choice to leave. You can leave your job whenever you want, but you're not getting paid every 2 weeks. Like that's sort of trade-off, but you
Yeah.
do have the choice. And so there's some freedom in that.
Yeah, I love the basketball example a lot. It reminds me of Space Jam, but it's a great counterpoint to like what if we did have an objective standard of what mattered? Like it's really not a great way to exist. And so I think that that is a great argument for optimistic nihilism. I know that we're coming up on time, so I just had a couple more questions I wanted to ask you. This is one I ask everybody, and it's just pretty broad, but what's something that bothers you about the world that we live in today? And what do you see as a potential solution to that? Or more specifically, like what's bothering you? What's bothering Andrew? And how what do you think can help?
Oh, it's funny because like there are definitely things that bother me, but they also don't. Like I don't let them bother me too much. But
Hmm.
I think what I was talking about before, when it comes into identity, I think, and that's sort of why I talk about the things that I do, is that I see identity as the root of psychological suffering. Like there's very little that people fear and worry about that doesn't have to do with the idea of themselves in some way, even if it's like secondhand idea of themselves, like their parents dying or their kids dying. It's like it still has to do with the idea of yourself. But most, 99% of the other stuff, it all comes down to our idea of ourself when it in terms of psychological suffering and fear and worry and all of those things. So I find it fascinating how much people defend that idea of themselves, but I've been able to more clearly see that it's because people would rather have a false sense of certainty of a negative perception of themselves than be uncertain about
Hmm.
what they are or who they are. I had a video talking about what I talked about earlier about, like, imagine if you didn't have a past, and it went pretty viral, and there was a lot of people who all of a sudden I started getting a ton of negative comments like, oh, tell that to this, tell that to my PTSD, like tell that to this, and I there's obviously I didn't want to, like, didn't put it out there trying to trigger people, but there's a lot of people like defending their suffering and saying like, oh, I can't let go of this, this is a part of me. Like, oh, easy for you to say, you don't have all the traumatic things that I've been through. And I don't mean to discount any of that, but at the same time, like, the harsh truth is that no one can let that go for you. No one's ever going to
Hmm.
let that go for you, and as long as you cling to it, you will continue bringing along with you some aspects of your suffering. So only you can let that go. And you don't have to. I'm not saying that you have to. I'm not saying even that you should, but you can, and you're the only one that ever can. You have to be willing to do it yourself. And it's not, doesn't mean it's easy or anything like that. But yeah, that, and just like our identity based sort of psychosis, that there's so many things that's in our society that reinforce that and are, the divisive society that we exist in, the inherently divisive society, with even just, having everything from countries to all that stuff, is like there's no actual lines in the sand, there's no actual lines in the earth. And
Yeah, it's
I
arbitrary.
get, yeah, I get the idea of countries maybe being helpful to a degree, I guess, at least in a society that's as identity based as this. But like, it doesn't have to be that way. We're just inhabitants of Earth at the end of the day. So yeah, things like that. And then just people who are in those positions of power that rely on that division to maintain their sense of power, is like, there's a path that got them to that place. So I see that, and I would do the same thing if I had their upbringing and was in their position, but it doesn't mean I have to agree with it. And so I think there's a lot of aspects of that that are frustrating sometimes too.
Sure, that's a good answer. I like the idea that it's only up to you. Only you can solve for your own problems, and like I even love the fact that you don't have to. Like there are things that are part of your identity that you might not want to give up, and that's okay too. But it's ultimately your identity is up to you to decide. So I like that. Andrew, this has been a great conversation. I feel like we could have easily gone for another hour. This has been really fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me, Johnny. I had a blast going back and forth with you.